how, how much demand is there for ball fields, etc. Maybe what you do is you take that first step, but as a part of the community survey, you also kind of bake into it the aspect of the recreation center so that you're able to kind of test while you're doing a comprehensive park recreation open space study. You're also testing community interest in a recreation center. If it would appear that that is a high ranking, something that's highly desired, maybe that's then when you initiate a rec feasibility study. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because I think you want to ask the questions if you're doing a comprehensive park and recreation study. You want to ask the questions about people's need for an indoor, recreation space. I think that was part of the discussion the last time, and what the nature of that recreation space is. If the community isn't really expressing the interest, there's no reason then to move forward on the rec feasibility.
And it can be asked in a number of ways, such as questions
Right.
about the kinds of things. What do you do indoors for recreation? I mean, just sort of in that dappling of what is it that people are presently doing, or where do they do them, if they do them in the township or they do them other places. So you're making that bridge.
Or it's civic gathering space. It's not just recreation space, but I would do that, Karen. So I think we could describe one of the aspects of a comprehensive park recreation open space would be trying to really get at, through the community engagement, the needs assessment of the community for recreation, as well as for community space, etc.
Okay.
Then the description under the feasibility study is if it would appear that first survey that there is interest, then you could start doing a market analysis, casting the net beyond Elizabeth Township to see really kind of what other people can you attract to that facility to help pay
Right.
for operations and maintenance and that kind of stuff, and then go through what needs to be included and how big and where and all that kind of stuff.
Dan, is that workable based on what you were thinking about last week?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ted, go ahead.
No, Steve, go ahead.
No, I just want you to know I had reached out, and one of the community members, we've reached out to AGH about the possibility of working in collaboration with us to do a center around a fitness center around in the community somewhere located centrally in cooperation with a school district. We did this a couple of months ago.
Okay.
And I don't disagree that having an overall, this is what this comprehensive plan is, right? Looking at those things that we think are what the public wants. But, and really where that ended up is, they're waiting for us to have a proposal sent to them and what this might look like. So I don't want to say that that's going to happen. I can't say that for sure, but this is an area of the county that AGH really has not done anything like that. And I think there was some, the gentleman we spoke to does these plans around with AGH and at their facilities. So there's a conversation out there that we start with them. Again, nothing's in writing. It was a really good conversation. Matter of fact, I thought it had some potential, but I don't know, AJ, where that, I do get the idea of having an overall plan around recreation facilities and, ascertaining what those needs are. But I think a progressive community would benefit from having some type of facility that could be a combination facility, not only where it would have physical fitness equipment and the like, but also spaces for meetings and those kinds of activities as well. So,
yeah, I don't disagree. I guess what I was trying to say is both those studies have typically have some sort of survey work. What I was suggesting was the first study, if it makes sense to do the comprehensive park, make sure you bake into that survey enough questions about the need for, say, a community space, so that that helps you jumpstart working on a feasibility study if it makes sense. If
And-
there's interest in terms of doing that. And
That's
what,
true.
hold on, Carolyn. Bart, what you had just described, Carolyn actually worked on one a few years ago over in North Huntington with Excella.
Excel.
So this is before, when Excella was probably in a little bit better shape, before they started becoming the battering ram for UPMC and AGH, to do exactly that. And they looked at taking some existing space in some of the shopping center area that wasn't being quite as utilized, doing joint programming with the township. So it's not even just AGH. I think there's some other players out there, and we did one over in Beaver, which was with the YMCA, because the potential customer base for the YMCA was probably a little on the thin side. If they could broaden that and be able to direct some of the school athletics to some of the facility, now they were game. You know, they would sit that. So your point of the public-private, however you want to describe those partnerships, you're spot on. And that is the type of thing in the feasibility study, how you finance or you fund it,
Right.
get it off the ground.
Yeah.
That's where that comes in.
I mean, Bart, we can send over just as the example on that North Huntington one that has it, because they ran the scenarios. If this were municipally funded by percentage, if this were privately health funded
Right. That's
percentage, and
Right.
that's exactly the kind of thing that feeds from that initial inquiry of what people have a willingness to be at the table. Right?
Right. Well, that's all driven by that. So again, I'm in support of that, but that's a component that I think it was laid out in some of the other things about partnerships. So I don't
Got
want to
it.
lose sight.
So Christian, I think that Bart's comment of expanding that a bit about who could be at the table without listing a particular healthcare provider, but the healthcare community, so that if it's AGH or if it ends up being another one, depending on what that scenario or willingness of someone is, right? Or if they change names by 3 years from now, what have you.
Right.
Okay.
The other,
Go ahead, Ted.
okay, the concern I have is if all we're looking at is athletics for like soccer and baseball and having something like that, if there's an older population that is wanting to have a community space that is needed, maybe we're talking about more than one area then in order to have something like that work. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because like some of this feedback that's coming back is going to be athletic based and people who want to go ahead and do health based things. I'm not saying senior citizens don't, but I'm saying that there are, we had talked about meeting spaces before, which I don't know how well meeting spaces, join in with that. So I also know that like a former neighbor of mine had dedicated lands to the township for public recreation back in the day. Mr. Howell had done that. So I don't know how many different places we have. I mean, I think we almost need to get an inventory of that, of how many different places there have been out there that have been dedicated lands for purposes.
And that I think in terms of what Russ was calling out and what AJ identified in looking that broader study first, that puts all those kinds of things on the table and evaluates them as to what's considered public spaces and what, is not, or quasi-public.
Yeah, I think as part of that study, you would come up with a listing of like, what's all the land that the township owns, okay?
Yes, sir.
And what are the strings that are attached to those different parcels of land? Because I know there's been land been given for different reasons. And typically there's some, when they did that, they said, well, it has to be used for this or that or the other. And you kind of have to get that all in one document so people can see, okay, you can do this thing here, but you can't do it there. And that way you can move forward with, if you want to have a meeting space, okay, we can put it here, we own that land, and it fits into the whatever strings are attached to that land.
And Carolyn, the other thing I wanted to add to which was, I guess, responding to Ted. So customarily, when you're doing a comprehensive park and recreation study, you are trying to make sure you're canvassing all sectors of the population. So while you may be reaching out specifically to athletics, to different sports associations, etc., Ted, you're also trying to find, and we're seeing this much more increasingly, the organized athletics. While the numbers for participation are down, meaning the signups for different leagues, etc., are down, it's the alternative forms of recreation and leisure are on the upswing. That's anything from the walking, silver sneakers program types of stuff to senior programming, etc. So, Carolyn, we need to make sure that we describe that comprehensive park recreation open space plan with enough detail for guidance so they know what they should be asking as a part of those surveys, that type of thing. And so, Ted, if those results are coming back that you're starting to see people are looking for alternative forms of recreation, that should start to shape what the rest of that planning study really is kind of delving into. And some of it may splash into what happens in terms of, if I need indoor space, what is the nature of that indoor space? Is it functioning as a senior center? That was part of the North Fayette Excella partnership, and that's what triggered it. The seniors said, enough. We're tired of having this tiny little room with a coffee pot to play Parcheesi and cards. We want to be able to do other programming and to have exercise, fitness on our own. So Ted, I think your question kind of cemented in my head. I think we need to make sure that the questionnaire for that comprehensive park recreation delves into the needed space for recreation, community space, not just canvassing ball fields and that kind of stuff.
Because where are the bocce courts, right? If that's going to be a thing,
Right.
right? It's what do people think?
I mean,
Correct.
it could be frisbee golf. It could be dog
Yep.
park. It could be all sorts of things like that.
Yep.
And that you're a complement to the other things that are around you, not repeating them. So if you don't want to be spending the dollars on certain things, right, that because you can guide people to places that are nearby, but you want to be doing the thing that's going to potentially be your programming, be unique. If it is a cost of income type of avenue for you, or what have you, right? And how those things are funded, all going into there. And how many people you need, or what kind of operational types of things do you need to address? That would be all in there. Those 5 items, really: the facilities, the programming, the finance, the administrations, and the operations would be all examined as part of that.
Right. My concern is just when a survey comes out, if like a whole bunch of people are steering it one direction because the way the questions are asked,
Yeah.
and then you get that back and you say, oh, look at how this is going, it may not really be indicative of what was meant. That's all I was trying to say. I have another question on ball fields and so forth, and I don't want to go off topic here, but like there are school places that have baseball fields, like over, and it's not in our township, it's in Forward Township and so forth. Is there a way to have some use of those fields outside of the uses that the school is using for their things?
You had to go there.
Okay, I was just trying to see if there could be a partnership there. That's all.
Bart, close your ears. I'm speaking candidly. We try this all the time, Ted, and it seems to fail in utter in flames. It is difficult, and by today's safety standards, Carol and I worked on a park and rec study down in Florida, which was Parkland, where one of the shootings was. They have that's Broward County Schools. For years, they've had mutual agreements that during off hours, the community could use the basketball courts, inside the gymnasiums, the ball fields, the soccer fields. And after the shooting occurred, that chain link fence literally surrounding everything, that was a non-public zone because of safety concerns. I believe that behavior, kind of that reaction, really kind of permeates through everything now. It is very difficult to be able to get everybody to be on board and comfortable with having public access. With that said, that should be explored, and let somebody say, no, it can't be done.
Because I'm going to switch you here, AJ, because Mount Lebanon School District, as an
Correct.
example, has an agreement of playgrounds that are at elementary schools that are available for residential use when school is not in session. So it is about a whole slew of things, I think, in the combination of what people are ready, willing, and able to do in those things. And the municipality actually relies upon them because they don't have some of their own facilities in portions of the municipality for people to be able to access easily. So.
Okay, I didn't want to go off topic there. I just was thinking.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and we can hit on it, that those opportunities should get explored as a part of that comprehensive study. It's my only comment is, thus far, it's been very difficult to ever get that to work.
Okay.
You can unplug your ears now, Bart.
Okay, I think the two other topics that we heard in the last couple of days, and Bart or Russ, I don't know if you have anything that may relate to either one of these, was some of building actually on AJ's and Rob's back and forth there at the beginning about sort of thinking about what the amenities are and who we're trying to attract, and how that sort of falls into ultimately what kinds of housing there is and what there is for people to do, which also has a tangent tied to some of the policy questions about some of the areas potentially for the residential, their designated growth versus the rural resources. If it's all right with everyone, Christian, would you be able to put up some of the considerations that we were thinking about in the last day or so related to some of the policy question? And we do then also, before we head off, have the results of some of the people who have given their feedback on priorities. So we want to hit on that beforehand.
So the first slide that Christian has up on the screen, and Ted, your question in terms of the email, I think precipitated. We probably need to step through this, and if some of this detail really should get folded into the document, let us know. Hopefully, this is clarifying how mechanically we laid out some of these suggested recommendations related to zoning. The first thing was this notion of the designated growth areas and the rural resource areas. And where that came from were these kind of purposes that you guys were defining in terms of wanting to protect the green character, the rural character of the community, fostering improvement of impaired lands where it's practical or feasible to be able to do that. Fill in skipped land that's surrounded by other development. This is Dan's point. I may not be saying this quite in the same words as he did, but we've had places that maybe it's a ridge that hasn't developed and it's surrounded by other development, and maybe there was an issue, maybe a development project fell through, financing went away, whatever. In the idea I think you guys have expressed is, rather than tear up a field somewhere and have a new development, why don't we encourage development in those kind of skipped over areas? 4, broaden and diversify housing options. So Ted, this gets at the heart of what your email was. Your email was focusing on the densities. That's not really while there's a little bit of density change that we would suggest, it's really this notion, when you look at the uses that are allowed in your residential districts, So if you have 4 residential districts, you basically are all Henry Ford. You're allowed to have a single family, a single family, a single family, and a single family. And what people have expressed repeatedly is, what about patio homes? What about duplexes? I don't want that big lot. How do we allow that? And so our recommendation really wasn't so much about the lot size. It was more about how to broaden. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. And then the last one, purpose, I think you guys have been swirling or batting at, is how do you provide more flexibility for commercial, or maybe to kind of rephrase that given what Russ had said before, because it wasn't commercial just purely in a retail restaurant standpoint. We probably want to say non-residential development, because it could be light industrial, it could be other stuff that is making things, not so much just selling things. So the idea of those purposes seemed to be kind of a challenge in some portions of the community because of the lay of land or where infrastructure was. And while you guys are making adjustments in terms of where sewer and water will be in the future, what we had showed in the plan in the draft, those yellow areas were the designated growth areas. So this is something the MPC allows you to do. And then the green areas were the rural resource areas. So when you read the MPC, what they're quietly saying is the designated growth areas are the places where you want to see development occur. And it may be on one of those skipped over sites. It may be an area that's a green field, but it's within a sewer shed. So there's already pipes nearby that would make sense to connect to and be able to capitalize those sewer improvements you need to pay for. So you get enough from their tap-ins, etc. But the green areas then would stay kind of that green area and would be sparsely developed, less dense, so to speak. And so the idea, Christian, if you go to the next step, how kind of the designated growth areas in our mind would work, they would be added to the zoning map as an overlay. And the purpose of the overlay for a growth area would to be broaden land uses. So rather than maybe being an R2 district and only allow single family, maybe now I'm allowed to have duplexes or patio homes, or maybe 0 lot lines, or maybe accessory dwellings. So I have a carriage house. So I'm now getting two units on a lot as opposed to just one. And maybe it's the accessory dwelling on an existing lot that's already been created to be a half acre or an acre, which is a lot of what your lot sizes are. I know there's a little bit of aversion to townhouses in apartments, and I think maybe in the R3 district, maybe that would make sense. But the idea was not necessarily to change really dramatically your lot sizes, but it was really more to broaden what types of land uses would be allowed. The same with maybe the non-residential stuff, because you could do the same thing on your non-residential zoning districts. There could be some increase to density, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then there's infill standards where you're trying to have, maybe in a place like Boston, you're trying to have, on the fringe of Boston, maybe a parcel that used to have development on, and it's been vacant, the building's been raised or whatever, and you're trying to get development back there. How you put some standards within the zoning to kind of encourage that development. So if there was a metal shop, a cabinet maker that wanted to be there, they kind of they gravitate towards those sites because there's more incentives for them to do that. So the designated growth area comes up with inducements, incentives for development. Different than, Christian, we go to the next slide. The rural resource areas starts to take away incentives. So what you're doing with those two overlays is creating a set of attractive things that make people, it's like smearing honey on the picnic, the picnic table, and the flies are going to be attracted to those areas. And then I have citronella in a bucket over here, and it's taking them, it's pushing them away. The flies don't want to be around that area. And sort of the rural resource area, while it's meant to be an attractive place, maybe there's a resource protection step that you have to take account for your steep slopes. You got to account for poor soils, those types of things, so that your density is calculated by deducting out places, the land that can't support a lot of development, because your ordinance does not work that way now. Your ordinance works of, I have, say, 100 acres, and I have my minimum lot size, and all I have to do to determine is whether I have SOAR or don't have SOAR, and that's how many units I calculate. Greg, is that true? Okay, so it doesn't account for where I got steep slopes. Everybody's getting credit for those land areas that have some challenges. Some of them may be Mother Nature, some of them may be man-made, in terms of what those are. So what we were doing is attaching this resource protection step to the rural resource areas. And so consequently, what you're doing is putting less density, less development in the rural resource areas, in more development in the designated growth areas. Christian, go back a couple slides.
So there's one other
One more.
aspect to this.
So again, more density in the yellow areas and more diversity in the type of development in the yellow areas, less density in the green areas.
So some people may have the reaction of, well, aren't the people in the green going to get all wound up because they get less density and therefore they get fewer lots and all of those kinds of things. It ends up largely balancing out because the quality of the development or the type of development that can occur in those areas can often have a different fiscal side of things, right? Because there isn't it's that balance of what the costs are, because you aren't disturbing those areas, you're actually preserving them, and therefore then you have a lot of different things to consider.
Well,
All in all, being benefits to both sides. Go ahead, AJ.
Then the second part of that, Christian, go back to the slide for rural resource. What we're also suggesting is adopt a conservation development, conservation subdivision that you attach is only permitted within the rural resource areas. So conservation development, you guys have PRD. So PRD allows you to have flexibility in terms of your lot size. That's something that is legislated specially in terms of the MPC. You have that as an option. You need, though, infrastructure as a part of the PRD. What we're saying is conservation development would allow a property owner to get the same number of units that they would get under the base zoning. So Carolyn's concern is somebody's going to say, well, I don't get as many houses on my 100 acres or my 50 acre, gentleman farm. Well, they are going to get their same number of units, say it's 50 acres, 1 acre lot size. So in theory, they would get 50 houses, but because they're off of sewer and water, they're on a sand mound or they got a septic. So they're probably really 1.5 to 2 acres. All we're saying is they have to fit those units within the developable land. So they may not get quite as many. And they can now have flexibility in having a smaller lot size. So they get the same number of units, but where they're putting the development the net density gets a little bit higher. And the areas they're not developing, they put into open space. So you record that no different than the open space in terms of your PRD. So the big difference between the conservation development and the PRD is one really is related to public infrastructure. A lot of your rural resource areas don't have public infrastructure, or the cost of getting the public infrastructure is going to be really high. It gives you the opportunity to still get development, but you're directing it into the land that has stable ground, it doesn't have environmental issues, etc. So, Ted, we looked at the designated growth area and the rural resource area being kind of an overlay that doesn't really, it flies over top of the base zoning districts. It really affects what happens in terms of your permitted types of land uses. It does affect maybe how much land development you get because of the rural resource, the resource protection step that we're envisioning. Christian, you want to go to the next slide? which is what this is. So the upper graphic on the right side is in the upper right corner is the rural resource of the designated growth area. This is not Elizabeth Township in terms of shape. Just it's just a sketch to kind of convey a concept. The green areas are those rural resource areas. The yellow areas are the designated growth areas. The second graphic in the lower right is your base zoning districts. So again, it's something that's imposed over top of the base zoning districts. Customarily, you want to make it voluntary. Okay. So if somebody wants to do something in the designated growth area, and they're asking for a broader set of land uses, you do it through a conditional use step. So back to the last public meeting we had, when I think it was Mr. Smith was really concerned about, wait a second, we have a lot of conditional uses, you know, and the way the township controls a lot of things is they try to make everything a conditional use. Be careful. But if you're trying to ask for a use that is unique to a particular area, like a designated growth area, maybe the conditional use is the step, and they have to go through that public hearing process. But as an example, so where the red line is, the first star, that property is within kind of the designated growth area. That property owner could opt to say, I want to be able to do townhomes in this purple color down here in my base zoning district is R2. Or they want to do patio homes. They could do that through a conditional use process. So I do need to have the overlay, because the overlay is what triggers that conditional use process. The overlay also is what gives me the broader set of land uses to do things like patio homes and duplexes beyond what your current ordinance says, because right now your current ordinance, in most cases, it says single family, single family, single family, or single family. And that is the kind of the antithesis of what a lot of people have talked about thus far, is they want to be able to have other housing choices. The orange line up at the top and stars is an example of the rural resource. If I'm I got my property up here, you know, same location, you know, whether I'm in the base zoning or I'm in the overlay, I want to do a conservation subdivision. Well, we can get that to be permissible in the blue zoning district. It can only happen though if you opt to do the rural resource overlay. And again, you do that as a conditional use, and they can do conservation subdivision now. So they can have a smaller lot size. They have to dedicate open space, and they got to play by the rules of protecting the steep slopes, the floodplain areas. I mean, we do red bed soils, all kinds of soils that are known to have development issues as a way of controlling where development goes and shouldn't go. Just using what kind of Mother Nature and what lessons learned have taught us. Ted, does this explain this more now?
Sort of. So like, it seems though, like we have an R1, R2, R3, R4, and whatever else, right? The different business things, light industrial, and all the different conservation areas and so forth. So I guess what I'm still looking at is if an area was, does R4 still exist? Does R3 still exist? Or
Yes.
is it now we are put into these two categories?
No,
And repeat
it's
it,
the
someone who's
bottom, it's the bottom map.
Yep, you keep your base zoning districts. And all we're saying is when you're in a designated growth area and you want to have more uses in that R4 area, you have to opt to do kind of the designated growth process as a conditional use. That would entitle them to have a broader set of land uses that you guys determine ahead of time what's appropriate, you know, so you go through a whole public review process to be able to do that. But you also may give them a little bit more density bonus. So maybe rather than a quarter acre lot, you'll allow them to have a fifth or sixth of an acre lot. So rather than 4 units per acre, maybe allow them up to 6 units per acre to be able to pay for probably why the parcel got skipped over in the first place. maybe there's more earthwork, or maybe they have to extend that soil and water a little bit further. Your base zoning districts, we think they should stay. And rather than starting to make major changes, use the rural resource and the designated overlays is the trigger or the tripwire to go through. Now, if I want to have more flexibility, I have to go through the conditional use process to be able to get that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it seemed to be what was checking off most of the boxes. I can't say all the boxes that everybody described, but I would say the vast majority of the boxes that people have described. And it's just taking two different approaches in terms of meaning the designated, growth areas and the designated rural resource areas.
It almost seems like there's a third category though. That's the tweeners that just don't exist.
And so what I said, Ted, is it is a voluntary process. That is the tweeners. The tweeners that don't want to mess with it. This is a weird animal. I've never had to deal with it. I just want to be allowed to do what I'm allowed to do in the base zoning district. That's the tweeners. You may want to make some changes. We think you need to make some changes in definitions, and you might tinker a little bit with the land uses. But the big changes I would tie with those, the rural resource and the designated growth area. You agree, Carolyn?
I do, and I had two other thoughts of in some of the things I think that Rob was talking about what brings people here. There are some situations with this that would allow for when you're talking about lot sizes or the kinds of dwellings that people may have an interest in. And I think that also then crosses over into what Dan was talking about in terms of the different lot or the different housing types, and also then the different market areas. So I think there's a lot of potential here that brings a couple of different perspectives actually together.
I want to bring in something that's maybe a little bit off this topic here, but one of the action items was to inventory and access industrial legacy sites to determine the extent of cleanup and restoration required to prepare that land. And I'm wondering, it seems to me we would need to do something like that before we set these growth areas and rural resource areas in stone, because depending on what you find and where it is, that may change as to where these designated growth areas are. You find some real ugly site, maybe you don't want that in your designated growth area, or maybe you don't want it in a rural resource area either. It seems to me we really need to find all that stuff to the maximum extent possible before we really have a solid idea of where are we able to grow, place new development.
And so the way in which we were looking at that example graphic of the yellow and the greens was in part based on where those infrastructure service areas. I mean, that was sort of right, that initial part. In the comp plan and introducing that as a type of concept, then ultimately through the ordinance update process, you guys can identify what is it specifically that you were just talking about, Russ, like what areas ultimately go into what gets to be the yellow versus what gets the green. Very workable. AJ, do you have other thoughts on that?
No. Christian, you want to go to the next set of slides. So, Ted, I think this tries to capture now R1 through R4. We think, and Carolyn, Christian will have to be clear about this. We're not saying dramatically change those base zoning districts in terms of maybe some of the boundaries of some of the districts. If you thought of like under your base zoning R1, you fundamentally allow single family houses. Under R2, you allow single family houses, and I believe conditional, you allow maybe a duplex or something like that, but it's conditional. So there's an extra step in there. When you get to R3, you have maybe a little bit broader set of some of the uses that you can do. What we're saying is under the growth areas, when you're in the designated growth area, you would just be getting a little bit more diversity, a little bit more option, but it's triggered through a conditional approval. So everybody is being able to get some sort of review. Under the rural resource, in Ted, or 3 maybe doesn't change whatsoever, because maybe or the rural resource doesn't apply to any of the R3 or R4 areas, which right now they probably don't, because in theory, those are your more density, had more density. So in theory, they needed sewer and water.
They should definitely have sewer in the water is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the dots on the slide were just trying to give you a little pictogram in terms of the order of magnitude. And again, from our perspective, it wasn't so much, your question was about the densities and the minimum lot size. It was less about that. It was more about how you giving people housing options that right now, they're not called out in your ordinance. There's not really a clear path for them to be able to get it. They can always go and try to get a special exception or do something like that through the zoning hearing board, which for most property owners, developers, they try to steer clear of that a little bit. The strategy was trying to find that nice balance of past issues, past concerns, wants and desires, and what people have identified as the needs in the community.
Would this process generate a lot of conditional use cases coming through? Because that, you have to have a hearing, and then the commissioners have to vote on all the conditional uses. Are they going to be swamped with a bunch of cases?
I think most of this would happen on a subdivision by subdivision basis, not on a lot by lot basis. So Russ, if somebody had a 25 acre site and they were coming in with 50 units, you would do all 50 units as a part of one hearing. You wouldn't do each individual lot. Is there going to be more? I don't know. It probably is more dependent upon the pace of development. The idea was clearly to give a path, because right now there isn't a very good path. You would literally have to go and change the zoning map or amend the zoning ordinance to do some of this stuff. And to some degree, that's why some stuff hasn't happened.
Okay, AJ, anything else on this one? We'll make sure if we wanted to hit on any other points in the plan, and just to highlight what we've heard so far from people about some of the priority actions or things they've been thinking about.
Well, I guess, Carolyn, I'd just go to like, Greg, you've been living, drinking, breathing this. Does this sound like a strategy that is trying to kind of make some bridges, and where you've had some difficulties or you haven't seen any activity because there's some obstacles in terms of how to get there?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think our base zoning needs a little help too, of course, which is what maybe what Russ is asking, improve that, make that a little more clear, but also add the overlays. I like overlays. Do you think they have to be conditional use?
No, they don't
if they're clearly defined.
Yeah, they don't have to be. I think for certain types of uses, you may want to make sure that those are conditional.
Yeah.
I think I'm going back to the apartment thing. You guys bristled, multiple times every time you said apartment. Well, it depends on what that means. If it's like 4 units or 6 units in a building, that's okay. If you're talking a 12-story building, everybody's going to go crazy. You probably, for something like an apartment, want to have that extra step in terms of the conditional, but to do a duplex or to do patio homes, conditional use, maybe not. So you can kind of customize that how you think it makes sense for the township.
Yeah, it's a good way to make the change without disrupting the entire zoning situation.
And you can do those fine tuning items of the non-conforming lots and getting some of those other things to work all out at the same time without, again, having fireworks going off, right? I mean, you're trying to get all this stuff threaded together cleanly. And
I guess what I was looking at is the fact that, like, several people had mentioned, Dan, you had mentioned it before about, look, these are areas that we have out there. If we go ahead and incentivize this, we can have people come and build lots in there and so forth. And there are places like we said, Arrow Drive, places like finish up the Foxdrum, places like over off Duncan Station area where you were talking about before, that I was thinking more of like specific areas that we're growing now that are ready to go, that have it situated there. And that what I was meaning about the tweeners is that some of these are going to be areas that have septic systems in them, but they're really not ready to have more development put in them just because of problems that they have. But because the definition of how the rural resource was without having that infrastructure in place, all of a sudden put them in a growth area, which may not be a growth area for that specific plot of that part of the township or whatever. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so what I was meaning by the gray areas was that there were some areas that were designated growth areas, yellow, and some like a different shade of yellow type of thing that were really not, they're kind of saturated as it is right now. That's not the area we're going over as much as some other area, just because of previous places that were blight that are now being taken down, that now have the opportunity to be able to put out there and so forth. I thought that we were sort of targeting that kind of thing.
Well, okay, and with that clarification, then maybe we need to go over the yellow areas shown on the screen right now and fine tune those. So, Carolyn, correct me if I'm wrong. The MPC gives us those two. There is nothing that says I can't have a growth area number 1, growth area number 2, correct? And distinguish the difference between the growth area
if one,
based on as Ted described, it may be a place where growth can occur, but it wants to be modest growth as opposed to some of the other area.
no, there is nothing in the MPC that stops you from doing that. I think it is a consideration for what the base district is underneath, and or if we're talking about different resources. So short of having, to get at each roadway corridor and things like that on this map, or, each valley, each hill in that way, while needing to study those base districts over top of here, to the natural resources over here, I think the comprehensive plan in that description of what this is can introduce that, if applicable, right, that the township can consider these types of things within its designated growth areas designations and classify them in the wrong words, best manner or the most responsive manner for those types of the land use arrangements, the access kinds of things.
So going back, if I may, so like when we were talking about the river districts and talking about certain like beads on a bracelet things and certain places where we would go ahead and say, hey, you're along the river, and because you're along the river in this certain area, a bed and breakfast would make sense here, and some other activities and so forth. But we were saying, let's not get in, Dollar General to go ahead and do that, and not have basically other things that are flooding in there. And so like that almost like counters along the river corridor. We were wanting to like make targeted areas of where things were happening, not saying, hey, look at you, we have designated growth areas in other areas that because it's yellow along that region, it could be said, oh, then I would like to go ahead and put in something that is counter to what we were looking at.
You lost me now. So
We're actually talking about Ted's talking about something as a different level, I think, than where you are, AJ.
Yeah, Ted, we talked about tourism zoning along the bike trail along the river, and that's different.
Right.
The premise here, maybe, and AJ, you can stop me if I'm off. The premise with this distinction of the designated growth and the rural resources is generally geared toward the residential base or the intensity of that kind of development, or in the uses that go with it. Typically, it is how it has been. So I think what you just brought up about the riverfronts is a distinct topic that can complement this, but the base zoning district for the riverfront, or if we're going to have another overlay associated with those, or if it's mixed use or if it's infill, right, it's operating at a different element, I guess, of just land use. I'm trying to really think about the mechanics of
Caroline, we're getting way in the weeds on this. We're starting to try to do a zoning map.
Yeah.
Which there's a whole process to create a zoning map.
Well,
So, Ted,
the way I see this is, yeah, we want to do something special along the trail, okay? But that would be underneath this overlay.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So so you come up with a special, zoning set of rules, whatever they are, along the trail. And then this overlay just sits over top of it, but it's that base zoning zone you have there that's going to control what's really going on along the trail.
And Russ, spot on. So the one thing that in terms of your base zoning that we do think needs to get tinkered with was that edge. Because I think in some cases, there's a lot of things, as Mr. Smith had pointed to at the public meeting, it's a little gray. It's gray in terms of use the bed and breakfast. It's a conditional approval, right? So that's not gray. You have to go through that step. There are things like you have this definition in terms of recreation related use. That's permissible, but exactly what does that mean? If I'm 4 blocks off of the trail, am I allowed to have a cafe? Do I fall under that category? So those are the types of things that under the base zoning, we think do need to get cleaned up so there's clarity. Some of it you might be able to do, but it's not really clear. And the solution is, well, let's just make everybody do a conditional use. So there's high level of scrutiny. Well, that's why some stuff's not happening, because you have to go through those extra steps. So there, Russ, I agree with you. There's some base zoning, or Ted, there's some base zoning stuff there I think probably needs to get tinkered with and cleaned up. But the big thing in terms of where you want to direct your growth and where you want places to stay green, that's what the 2 overlays are for. They're at a very high level elevation. The detailed stuff really happens in terms of the base zoning. And we don't think there's probably a lot of change with the R1, the R2 for sure. I mean, so much of the community is developed in that pattern. I'm not sure changing makes a lot of sense other than cleaning up non-conformings, so dealing with some setbacks and things like that. Maybe R3 needs to get tinkered with. But the overlays would give you in those districts a broader set of the residential uses that you could do. I don't necessarily agree with Caroline. I think you can have non-residential be broadened in the designated growth area as well. I don't think it is just about residential, because I think there's some things that on the fringes of Boston, you know, as an example, you probably want to be allowing to happen. That right now, I don't think it's clear whether you could have happen or not happen.
Yeah, I would venture to say our river conservation district is the least clearly defined
Yeah, right.
by far. Maybe that's good. Maybe that's what's helped us preserve it so far, you know, so it gives us a chance to really think about what we want.
Yep.
Dan, any other thoughts from melding this in to last week's discussion?
No, I think we're on the right page. I mean, we talk about developers, they're going to develop first and the plans are already, the infrastructure is there. So when we start thinking of all these little outlying areas in the yellow, that's going to be maybe later on down the road.
Okay.
Now, I've talked to a bunch of developers. I know where they're going already.
Okay. Anybody have anything else before the reveal of what the priorities are, the feedback?
It's just thinking about, you were saying like, you don't want the Dollar Generals down along the river or whatever. So I guess to me, that means you're gonna have to be pretty astute with how you set up the zoning or whatever the rules are for along there. Because once those rules are set up, you're gonna have no say about who can come in there, and if they fall within the rules, set up, you know, whatever they want, whether it's a Dollar General or whether it's a local businessman or a local folk artist or whatever. So you're gonna have to be real careful about how that stuff's written up, because once it's on the books, then you can't just say, oh, no, Dollar General, you're a big chain, we don't want you there. That won't work.
So Russ, since you brought this up, what do you think is the appropriate scale for along the river? Because my interpretation of what people have talked about, it's not so much about the actual use, meaning a Dollar General is a retail, which is really no different than a guy that sells bikes. It's retail.
Yeah, it's a convenience store, and
Okay,
to me, they're all sort of the same.
Okay, so if I was able to say my retail business can't be over, say, 2,500 square feet or 3,000 square feet, will I get a Dollar General? No, doesn't meet their formula. So I never have to mention anything about national chain. It's not about the national chain. I think what it is about is what the appropriate scale is along the riverfront. And the quaintness of those communities is what you all kind of gravitate towards of what makes it special. So focus on the dimensional standards that keeps it quaint.
So
and I was thinking too, is you don't want the big flashing billboards down there.
Deal with things like materials, deal with things like signage. Those are the things that you can control through the ordinance, and you're not having to get into, again, I can say in an ordinance, you can't have a building over 3,000 square feet. You can say that in the ordinance. And again, if it's a shoe store that's a national chain, at this point, I don't really care. Dollar General can put a $3,000 or 3,000 square foot store in. Who cares if it's a national chain? I'm not going to get a big parking lot. I'm not going to get kind of the big blank wall that you customarily get with the Dollar General, because the size of the building gets so large. I think the other thing is kind of in my mind, from what people have talked about, that notion of having kind of the tourism types of uses. That is where you need to go through the base zoning and determine which are the ones you really want to have by right. If it makes sense that a bed and breakfast is by right, I don't have to say, I can say in supplemental regulations that the bed and breakfast can't have more than say 5 sleeping rooms. So I keep the scale of the bed and breakfast small, but I don't have to make it a conditional use now because I can now handle the parking and all the other stuff. As opposed to, think of Connellsville where they put up by Martin's where they put the hotel. Okay, great that they can now support a hotel on the trail, but the scale of that building, it's a hotel, and you don't want to have, 40 rooms showing up in Buena Vista because it doesn't meet the scale. Now, if the hotel was 4 blocks off of the trail, off of the river's edge, maybe 40 rooms might be something you would entertain through a conditional use.
And guys, this I think goes hand in hand with last week's conversation, right? About what's the water side. I know we were using the floodplain, but it's almost like what's that relationship to the water side versus in the corridor versus this other land side, right? And then if that's a distinction that starts to get fine tuned.
So again, I think in the comp plan, we're trying to lay out some of the things that clearly it seems that the character and protecting the quaintness of those communities, those villages, those patches, keep that quaintness. And how do you do that is controlling scale. Obviously, you don't want to have a gentleman's club or a sex shop, adult bookstore. I mean, there's certain land uses you need to control and keep out of there. But for a lot of the stuff, it's really keeping the right scale and then determining where, okay, if I am out on a major, more heavily trafficked thoroughfare, maybe I can broaden those uses because now I'm really going to gravitate towards the road because I need those passerbys to get my business to work. And while I may be in a river town, I don't want to be on the river. I want to be close to that thoroughfare. And why do I want to be in that location? Because I know a lot of people are coming to the town to go to the boat ramp to get on the trail. And that's where I make my sales and stuff, but I'm going to be out by the road. And we can add a little bit more description in terms of when you're looking at making zoning changes, here's things that people have talked about and kind of memorialize that as a part of the comp plan. So when you do start looking at some of the zoning, that you're able to go back to and say, okay, here was objectives that we need to be able to maintain when we're exploring different ideas for the zoning.
Okay.
Carolyn, you want to share?
Yep. Or Christian, do you have it up? Either way.
Hey, I have to hop off, guys.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Dan.
Be a couple more minutes.
Sure, I can share.
Okay.
Hey, AJ, does form-based zoning play into that at all, you think, or is that like a dirty word? Or Carolyn?
No, form is not a dirty word. I think the river district probably would make a lot of sense to go a form direction. And again, Carolyn and I would call it a hybrid because you still got to control a little bit of land use. Like I said, you don't want the gentleman's club kind of stuff.
Right.
But for a lot of what you're doing is you're trying to control the scale of stuff, and that's what the form base is best suited for. Orientation, which street you want the buildings to really address, as if I'm on a corner, which is the primary versus the secondary, where to tuck parking, that kind of stuff. Form based makes the most sense.
And to the point though, Greg, it's not township wide. I mean, with
Correct.
all other things going on, your designated growth, you're trying to control those kinds of neighborhoods or
Yeah.
the resources, right? I mean, those are the controls for those areas, but you have the chance if it's in those specific corridors or, special designations, then you can really get at it. And it's not something that ends up getting painted in too many areas and it start to lose its special features. So, okay. So
Before you go any further, can I ask when did you produce this slide? Like
a couple of minutes
what
ago,
time? Just minutes ago? Okay.
like within the period of this meeting.
Okay, that's fine. I was late to the show. That's why I was asking. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I think this goes straight to the link, so it's right now. It's straight from SurveyMonkey, not from anything, we downloaded kind of thing.
Thank you.
All right, so see, the tall green one is actually there are 5 out of the 7 people expressing, that is the comprehensive park recreation open space plan. And then the one C2 is the feasibility study. We go to E3. This is the inventory and access industrial legacy sites to determine the extent of cleanup and restoration required. Some of these, I think what you're hitting on are there are some definitive partnering types of actions. Can we do B3 as well? Evaluate and access an expanded set of permissible land uses within the mixed use zoning district. And so you've got several of these I think we hit on in spirit last week and have solidified. What we should do is put it out to the group one more time, Christian, I think, and just see if there are a few more people that would like to be responding. But all in all, there are several of these that have multiple considerations. How we ultimately get to those top 5, it looks like we have at least 3 of them with some definitive direction. Any others on there, Christian, that you see?
Well, interestingly enough, I did not, C1 and C2 were my 2 obvious #1 choices, but I couldn't see voting for both of them. So I only picked one. But if you add the 2 of those together, it's by far the most important. And you could very easily add the 2 of those together.
I think you could. And I think that actually gets at a lot of the things that you guys were expressing in portions of last week and talking about what is it that the people of Elizabeth Township that, I mean, we talked a lot about the zoning and the policy, right? But that is not the topic that draws people's attention in the same way of thinking about what is this planning actually going to be doing for us, right, in our everyday lives. And that C1 and C2 are the kinds of things that contribute to people saying, all right, we're moving here, right? We're thinking about things and we're trying to figure them out and how they're going to be amenities or be more cohesive, right? As to bring in the portions of the township together and what the township offers. That's great.
So do we get to vote twice on this or just once?
I think if you go to your link again, it may say thank you. You've already given your input. Christian, is that about right?
Yeah, I think just if you use the same device, it will probably just let you do it once.
Oh, you just gave it away. Okay. Anybody have any concerns from the items from last week? That, I mean, in terms of the top actions, but I think we've gotten some things affirmed here.
So I have a concern on page 18. There were, the little tiny chart that you have that has cost, resource light, cost, resource intensive, short-term, long-term. There were only like 2 or 3 that actually appeared viewable to me. And I tried both a PC and an Apple. I tried Safari and Chrome and so forth. So I didn't know how many of those you had put out there. The little, you know what I'm talking about, the little 4-way chart type deal, which is sort of going to what we're talking about now, which are short-term things like let's hit this type of deal. So I didn't know if that was something that's just not showing up on our screen.
In some cases, I know that they were bumping down a page depending upon which one we had open, if it was in the Google file versus if we were looking at it after it had been downloaded. Christian, we can check that,
Yeah.
but there will be one for each one.
I didn't
Yeah.
see it many twice.
Yeah, so there is one for each one, and it's all set up like one action step per page. It's just
Right.
the formatting got kind of messed up once we shared it on Google. So yeah, I think at some point we can share just a PDF so you all can see how that looks.
Yeah, there is one for each one. I was going to see if I could pull it up before we get off the phone here.
I printed mine, Ted, and they were all on the ones that I printed.
I printed mine. I printed mine as well, and they were not.
Ah, I got mine. Interesting.
We'll work with that in the PDF and print it off before we post it, because I think that is the intent. And Bart, thank you for letting us know.
Some of mine, which I imagine would be like on this page, there's like a blank page. I imagine that's where that would be showing up. It's just that's how it comes up. That's just
They were at the bottom on mine. Every one of those areas when they came up were sort of clustered at the bottom.
Yeah.
We'll just check it out. There it is there, right there.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is kind of what the original will look like,
okay.
so that they do follow at each one, and it makes it very handy. So it's a page for action.
Right. That's
Yeah.
what I was.
This is what it will be looking like.
Yep.
Okay. The number one thing last week, which became like the number one thing that's not even here, was the whole blight thing.
I think we are going to include that. I mean, as the ones that we had last week, and we were sanity checking with this polling as to where they fell. I think
I
that,
know.
again, like 3 of those 5 were straight on that sheet. So we're all set.
I'm with you.
And we got to do that appeal to what is the general public, what are they absorbing versus what is Greg's marching order. And then the third one, Christian and Adrian and I talked about, is there are a couple of those that actually just sort of are the threads that go underneath all of these. So they don't necessarily fall in that top action list because they are the consistent action to keep everybody on the same page kind of test. That's that third set. So fantastic. Looks like can start working toward getting you then the public draft, if that's all right, to put that to the board. And then if we just wanted to affirm if there were going to be the July session for the board, if we should put that on our calendar.
Just Carolyn, maybe after this call, you and I can talk if everybody else, once everybody jumps off, or AJ and you and Christian, whatever, we could talk.
That's fine. We'll be ready to do what we need to this summer.
Thank you.
When it gets onto the applicable agenda, just to affirm that with the group. And then we will be ready to identify with you when it's appropriate for us to have any of the discussion about the plan. And then ultimately, Greg and the board arranging for that public meeting and a public hearing, right, as part of that public review process. So this is really come together, and you guys have delved into possibly some things I don't know if you even imagined you were going to be getting into, but we really are very excited that I think the things here are doable for you all and elevating what you're ready to do. Okay.
Thank you.
And I'm sure we'll get the link to the recording of the meeting.
Yeah, we'll put that together. We'll upload it to the cloud and then get the link out and send out sort of a post email tomorrow morning.
All right, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Anything else? Okay.
Nope.
All right, thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Good night.